Hi, I'm Brianna Caza. I received my Ph.D. from the University of Michigan, and I am now an associate professor at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. My research is largely centered on the intersection of identity and resilience. Specifically, I seek to understand how resources and processes work together to create environments where people can thrive amidst unexpected events and environmental changes. So specifically, my research right now is focused on people who are working in the gig economy, multiple job holding, and marginalized work populations.
All right. Thank you. I'm Allison Meister. I'm a professor of leadership and organizational behavior at IMD Business School in Lausanne in Switzerland. But I'm originally from Canada, and I did my PhD in Melbourne in Australia at the Melbourne Business School. So I also study identity like Brianna, and my research surrounds identity and mental health at work, and in particular, how it feels to be labeled, stigmatized, pigeonholed, marginalized, and stereotyped by others at work. And I look at the effects of this on things like stress, well-being, thriving, and feelings of inclusion and belonging in the workplace. So that's what I'm focused on at the moment. Today, Brianna and I are here to tell you a bit about some of the work that we've done together, and specifically around identity in the workplace. We're going to talk about some implications of this when it comes to women in leadership as well. We're going to keep this conversation pretty informal. So if we get sidetracked or have a laugh at some point in time, don't take that personally. So in particular, we're going to walk you through one of our most recent qualitative studies, which was first kicked off by Wei Zheng, who's at the Stevens Institute of Technology. So in this study, we explored how 92 men and women, really senior leaders, made sense of becoming a leader. So their origin stories and how they do their leadership. So how do they behave as leaders? Simply put, how do people make sense of and tell the story of their own leadership over time? And what can we learn from this? So the findings from this study suggest that despite the unique experiences of 92 different leaders in different industries across the United States, we found that their experiences were converging. The way they told their stories were appearing in certain patterns. So, Brianna, do you want to walk us through some of these first findings?
Sure. Just as you said, one of the big things that we discovered as we started diving into this data set was that even though we had a lot of variance in terms of the different types of stories that were told, they all converged around four core themes. And this became really apparent to us as we started understanding both, like you said, where they began and trying to, think about where they are now. And what we found is that they use kind of common frames to talk about their startings, their beginnings, and where they are now. And, as we were trying to make sense of these findings, we turned to the literature. And while the organizational and psychology literature tells us really clearly that people think about themselves in story form, they communicate who they are and what they do to others in this storied form, we don't have a lot of theorizing around this idea of origins or beginnings. Yet when we reflect back on, normal conversations and even how we just introduced ourselves, we often refer to our origins. That becomes part of our story. It's kind of like a stamp that affects, the way in which we think about our identity more broadly. So as we started to kind of think about this and trying to make sense of it, what we found is that there are four basic ways the leaders that we talked to, the very senior leaders, as you've mentioned, talked about themselves as leaders. So specifically, some use what we called a being frame. And this being frame is, essentially the story that I am a leader because I've always been one. Right? I was basically born to be a leader. And these individuals, when they talked about their origins, reached way back into their childhood, school age, or even before school age. So talking about on the preschool playgrounds, how they just kind of naturally emerged into this role of being a leader. And when we started looking at these individuals in terms of their current leadership experiences, this idea of being was also present. So specifically, they talked about their inspirational leadership style as being core to their leader identity, so who they were. In contrast, while these people focused on themselves largely in their stories, they were the main characters, we had another group of participants who focused on the role of others. And we ended up labeling this frame engaging. And in this frame, individuals kind of recounted being called upon, not necessarily, from externally, but also kind of internally towards a cause. And because this cause was so important to them, they focused on the doing of leadership. So they were gathering people around these particular, a particular cause. And when they talked about who they were as a leader today, they still focused on the process of organizing, of facilitating, of bringing people together around a common purpose or towards a common.
So that one you'd say is more action oriented around doing than just who I am. It's more tied to kind of what I achieve or what I'm doing in the moment or the activities that surround leadership.
Right. So the cornerstone of being is the leader, the person, and their inspirational nature. The cornerstone of the engaging is the activities. So the leadership behaviors, the doing itself. And so we have two other frames as well. So the third frame is performing. And we found that people were using a performing frame when they focused a lot on the positions or roles that they had early on, and the way in which these roles or positions gave them a certain type of authority or responsibility for a cause. And so when individuals who adopted these frames talked about their current leadership styles, they really emphasized things around control or support or guidance of their team. So it was very kind of paternalistic in that way. Finally, the fourth frame we had was the accepting frame. And these are individuals, and we all know them, who just kind of fall into leadership positions, right? So when they're recounting their origin stories, it's not this really salient memory of being on the playground, like being, and it's not, reflecting on one particular role. They just kind of awoke and found that people were following them, or that's how they kind of framed their stories, right? And so they tend to find themselves in leadership positions because others started doing things, behind them in a certain way. So as you can imagine, these people who had this leadership origin story tended to take a little more low-key approach to their leadership in real time now. And so they talked about their leadership style as being a little bit more casual, a little bit more emergent in, a particular context.
Would you say people who kind of discovered themselves as leaders when other people were following them, would they take, if you were thinking about the more traditional styles like servant-oriented leadership, would you say they more fall into that category?
Yeah, I think that they definitely see this is more of kind of a responsibility or a task that was put upon them, as opposed to being something that emerged from within or that kind of, happened as they were taking part in certain activities around a cause.
Super interesting. And so, it begs the question, which one do you think you are, Brianna? I mean, when we found this, it was really hard when we're analyzing this data. I must admit, you're kind of, and what I kept doing was, thinking of, I totally know somebody like that, or I know somebody like that. So I'm putting myself into one of these categories. So which one were you? And do you see it playing out somehow?
Well, yeah, we definitely had this conversation in our research meetings around, which one do we think that we are? How would we classify other people? And as a multiple identity scholar, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that in our data, while people had a dominant frame, they also had kind of secondary or sometimes even tertiary supporting themes is what we found. So, we really tried to code this data in every way possible. And in doing so, we noticed, not necessarily a systematic pattern of which themes clustered together, but instead what we noticed is that, people had a clear dominant theme, but some people told really complex kind of origin stories, in which it was clear that they had kind of a multifaceted view of who they were as a leader, and they really acknowledged and noticed the confluence of factors that led them down the path that they're on currently. So to answer your question, I think my dominant theme is definitely engaging. When I think about early periods of time in which I felt like a leader, it's definitely focused on activities. And being a person who loves animals, has always been drawn to animals. Some of this kind of leadership was around horses or, animals, doing activities in which I was able to accomplish a task, along with other people. So I would say that most of my salient memories of leadership are all very activity focused. What about you? Which one do you think that you are?
No, it's funny because I feel like we're the exact opposite, and maybe that's why we get along. We're super complementary.
Right.
But I think when we first started exploring this, I remember thinking, well, how would I tell my story? When did I first become a leader? If someone asked me, and what pops up into my head, the first experiences that pop into my head before I kind of write out what you would say in a traditional job interview was around roles. So I think that makes me a performer in that I think to my roles in high school, or as I was very into sports, and in particular volleyball, for example. I remember being a volleyball team captain. So I think of having a team that I was felt like the leader of, or I was this student council president in my high school, and I had certain responsibilities. So I tend to naturally gravitate towards that. So that would definitely be my dominant lens, I guess, if I were going to say. And then if I were going to move towards a secondary, I would probably be around actually the being. So I feel like I kind of was. Maybe it's because I'm a firstborn child, and the research shows that if you're firstborn, sometimes you're thrust into being the leader of your younger siblings. And so sometimes I think, well, I was naturally kind of put in this role. And so those are my two. So they're the opposite side.
That's so interesting. I like how you reached way back into your origins to think about that. Right. I think it would be a fascinating follow-up study to see how birth order affects this, because I'm a middle child, and so we definitely have to do activities to get noticed.
That's true, actually.
That might be baked in as well. And then, of course, when I think about you, I see you as a leader because you're also just so tall and charismatic. So,
Well, and it's funny you say that, actually, because if you think when I'm reflecting on some of the quotes that we analyzed over and over again, and I'm sure Wei would echo this, I think one person actually said, well, I'm a natural leader because look, this was a man in the study said, I'm a natural leader because I'm like 6'5" with a low voice. So people naturally see me as one. So it's interesting how, what people naturally think of when it comes to leadership. And I guess that ties into the prototypes that we have for what a leader is and who a leader does. And one of the interesting things of this study is it does kind of surface what people's natural prototypes are for leadership. And then if you look at it over across trends, you can look at kind of societal prototypes of leadership too. So yeah. And I love that. I like the origin story. I really like about this the origin story lens on it, because it is a natural way we think about telling the story of how we became who we are. So if you think of Michelle Obama's book, Becoming, it's about becoming who you are. And when you first meet someone, it's natural to say, how did you end up a professor? Or, when we tell people how we met, we often go back to that first time we met when I was a Ph.D. student sitting in Melbourne Business School up in that lounge, or connecting at a conference, 10 years ago. So we often talk about our origin stories just naturally, because it helps us place people into interesting boxes, I guess, which is not what we typically do.
Yeah, I think that, we talk about these origin stories as being rhetorical devices that help us organize and understand who we are, but it also helps us understand our motivation. So why we're doing what we're doing. And I think that becomes, this interpersonal curiosity we have about others. So like you said, it just comes up naturally, and it's, clearly captured in our collective consciousness when we hear things like Michelle Obama's Becoming, and I say here because I listen to the audio version, or other stories. Marvel has made millions of dollars, talking about origin stories of characters. So it is a natural inclination that we have to understand origins, because it helps us to really unpack the why of, what people are doing and make sense of their actions, and also, to set up expectations of what they will be doing.
It's funny because that triggers the question for me just on origin stories, and then we'll move on to the next part. But do you think that there's any danger in telling the same origin stories over and over again? So can that lead to anything? Why I ask that is, I think, one thing is, does it lock you into certain ways of seeing yourself and certain self-definitions if you're constantly kind of telling the same story over and over again, if that's like the dominant main story in your mind, whether it's about leadership or even how you met your spouse? I mean, is that, is it a good thing or a bad thing?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And just thinking back into our data, I know at some point we were trying to unpack, is there a difference between those people who have one, kind of all their eggs in one basket in terms of one dominant origin story, versus those who are a little bit more flexible and were able to, recognize the activity-based, the role-based, and also kind of the person-based attributes that might have affected their origins and shaped their path. We were not able to find a really systematic pattern within our data, but I do feel like we have some evidence that for women in particular, being in an engaging frame does kind of lock you into or demands that you continue to do leadership activities, right? So why don't you tell us a little bit more about what we found in terms of gender, and we can, maybe circle back.
Go on from there. Circle back to that. Yeah, what patterns it might lock you into if you're not aware of what your origin story is giving you, or what kind of behaviors it's triggering in you. So, okay, let's think about the gender differences. So we had 92 leaders, and we had a matched sample of men and women, all at the same level across similar industries. And what we found were some clear similarities and differences when it came to gender. And I think the similarities are as much as interesting as the differences. Because when it comes to the similarities, the being frame, for example, I was a natural born leader, was equally mentioned in male and female narratives. So their origin stories and their enactment stories. So how they do their leadership. This natural born leader came off as very consistent, just equal. In fact, we had the exact same number, 50-50 men and women who felt like a natural born leader. And the other one was the accepting frame. It was also 50-50 men and women, which was around, this kind of more naturally accepting of the leadership role. So when people saw me as a leader, then I started to feel like a leader. These servant-oriented leaders. I do leadership in the service of others because others want me to be a leader. So that was equal men and women. I think that's interesting because I think a natural tendency would be to think that women were more of that, right? As we know, there's huge gender differences in leadership, that when women are underrepresented through all levels of leadership, even more significantly as we get to the top. So often people would think, women more fall into that kind of service, or they don't step up, but it's not that. So this accepting frame is actually 50-50. So I thought that was a really interesting study, or interesting finding from the study. And then the next interesting finding was around the differences in when it comes to how men and women tell their leadership origin stories. So the engaging frame was much more used for women. So almost double the amount of women used this engaging, facilitative leadership narrative frame when they talked about their leadership. So remember, this engaging is about seeing yourself as a leader when you're actually doing the activities that you define as leader activities. Like Brianna, you mentioned around horses and animals and taking initiative. And so, and the leaders in this frame often do this in a more facilitative way. So what's interesting in this is that if you have this particular frame, your sense of leadership could be more fleeting or ephemeral, because if you're not engaging in these activities, so I'm not doing leadership activities right now, you can actually just stop seeing yourself as a leader. Well, I'm not a leader because I'm not actually doing anything that's would be representative of what a leadership does, of what a leader does.
Slippery.
Yeah. So that it also, this finding also helps us to explain some of why the research is showing us that women are often asked to take on more activities, right? So, for example, there's a wealth of research that shows in academia, women are often more asked to do service activities that are not formally recognized. They're volunteer activities. They're they're asked more, and they accept to do this more. And our study kind of shows this a little bit, because if you think, many more women than men fall into this pattern of, I'm a leader because I'm doing leadership. So of course I'm going to accept to do these activities, because that's leadership for me, taking on important activities for the service of facilitating others. And so one quote, I'll give you I've written down a direct quote from one of the study participants. And this woman said, I was willing to try different things or volunteer for things that weren't specifically in my job responsibility at all. I'm not sure if I ever had that aha moment, now I'm a leader, because it's always like being able to help to get people to work together, to do leadership. And another quote was, finding the work that you're interested in and engaging in it is much more natural than stepping up and taking on the formal leadership role. So, women were much more likely to be to do leadership rather than to say, to claim a leadership role. Now, again, this doesn't mean that men don't do this. We still had a good portion of men who had this as a dominant frame. It was just much more represented in women.
Yeah.
So that was one of the first big findings.
And so, just building on what you said, since we did this study, you and I have been chatting back and forth, and sometimes we'll find something in the media that when we think of it through the lens of our findings, helps us to make sense of why that would happen or why we would see this pattern. So, there's a lot of data that says that women in high-powered roles tends to find themselves more burnt out. And one of the reasons, based on our data, could be that women feel compelled to continually enact their leadership, right? It is slippery. It's something that they have to keep doing if they want to stay in that leadership position. They don't have kind of the piece that I am a leader and, I've proven myself. They have to kind of keep proving themselves through these activities. So just like you said, they take on more service activities, more, roles of organizing. They might informally kind of organize the crew. They might take notes of the meeting, set the agenda, so on. So, just coming back to what you asked about how these things might lock us into a track, that is one place that our data does suggest that having a really dominant, strong focus on something like engaging and having your leadership be very activity-based may actually force you to continue to use all of your energy towards proving your leadership over and over again. It's not just something you can kind of feel like, I'm a leader, settled into.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that it is important, and it's important to point out that it's not like one of these frames is better than the other. We often get asked, is one of these frames better? Am I a better leader because I am a born leader? Absolutely not. This isn't related to performance in terms of better or worse leadership. But yes, you can reflect and say, I might be, overdoing it because this is just natural for me. This is naturally what leadership is to me. Leaders don't say no, so leaders don't say no if an important task comes up. And it also shows, it might say a little bit about why women are known to kind of step up in those crisis situations or be asked to step up in crisis situations, because that's all about doing and, doing leadership in the moment. So I think that's interesting. And it ties into the next key difference is the performing frame. So remember, just to remind us, the performing frame is around feeling like a leader. This was the one that I fell into, that you feel like a leader when you actually have the formal role. So your leadership and how you've become a leader is more tied to, okay, well, I have the role of a leader, so I'm going to be a leader because this is my role, right? The formal role. And men were almost 3 times more likely in this study. So we had 3 times more men who took up this than women. And so this is tied to the formal positions you had. So you see it's around taking decisions and being responsible for your kind of job portfolio. So,
Yeah.
like a representative quote here is one, somebody said, look, you feel like a leader when you're able to make decisions and influence the organization without having to work through someone anymore. You're leading a department. You can influence things directly and not have to run them through an intermediary that might not see the same vision as you. So, you take it upon yourself to run that. And I think, I think that's really interesting, because that shows if you have this lens, you might see yourself as a leader just because you have the role. So it's not even as much as what you do in the role. It's just because you have the title, you have the business card, right? And it's funny when I say that, it's true. I think I did a LinkedIn post maybe a couple of months ago where I said, oh, here's all the business cards I've had throughout my career. And I guess in reflecting on that, and then having told you that this was my dominant lens, obviously I have tied a little bit of my leadership to the different roles I've had, not through my tasks. Yeah.
Right. So, Ali, how can these findings help us to understand or maybe explain some of the issues or the underrepresentation that we see of women in leadership positions?
Mm-hmm. So I think because of, tying back into what I said earlier around exposing some of our societal, but, individual prototypes as well for what we see as leadership, I think these findings and the similarities and differences in the use of these frames helps us understand, for example, why men might be more likely to put their hand up for a formal leadership position and to be seen as more fit for that formal leadership position, right? And so that's still that old paradigm that I would like to die, soon, of think leader, think male, is that these formal roles are often tied to, our conceptions that, oh, this is more fit for a man. And so I think that, this is kind of showing that the data is showing that actually many more men fell into the, I feel like a leader when I'm in that role. So I think if you feel like you're a leader only when other people are looking at you as a leader, so if you're in that accepting frame or engaging, you're probably not naturally as likely when a leadership role comes up to go, oh, I want that position, because it's not really matching to what you see as what leadership is. I think this highlights that in general, to be more inclusive in leadership and in organizations, and to find and really develop the best talent, whoever they might be, we have to get better at practicing all these frames and seeing people who use different frames than ourselves or different frames and positions as doing amazing work in leadership. So leadership, like I said before, this isn't tied to performance. You can be a high performer in all of this, but if you're looking for that next leader in your organization to fulfill that next role, don't just look to people who've had that position before. Look to what people are doing. Look to how we see who others might see as inspirational types of leaders for them. So I think society in general needs to challenge and upgrade this kind of underlying prototype of who a leader is and how people need to do their leadership to be strong leaders. If we can start seeing if we can start seeing leaders in different ways, not just by the positions that they've held, then I think we're going to have way better access to diverse talent from anywhere, looking any way.
Yeah. So validating multiple frames is something that organizations and managers should look into. Or, what are the ways in which the practices that they have within their organizations recognize, acknowledge, and validate these frames as being real leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Summed up perfectly. Thank you. So, I think what this shows is that context is really important when it comes to leadership. So what is the context in which, that you're brought up? What is your origins, right? What is the context in which your leadership was shaped? So that shapes who you see as doing leadership and if you see yourself doing leadership. And I think that's triggered our work as well, our next kind of project on the context of leadership and how the place in which we do leadership shapes our work identities in general. So maybe, before we close off this conversation about our research, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the next kind of study we're working on together.
Yeah, I would love to. So in our next phase, our next chapter, our collaborative work with our co-author Blake Ashforth has begun to zoom in a little bit more on individuals' relationship with the places in which they come from and that they do their work. And so our very thorough review of the literature at this point has demonstrated all of the ways in which, place and the places that we're in become intertwined with our sense of who we are. So what we basically find, as we've been, trying to unpack this process through which this relationship occurs, is that on one hand, individuals internalize, these little bits and pieces of their context into their conceptualizations of who they are. So, we've been talking about looking at leaders' origins, and we could think about, well, what about the places in which they first felt like a leader? How does that kind of show up in their sense of who they are and how they lead? And then, the other side of that is thinking about the context in which you're in and how that brings to the surface different identities or identity dynamics that people have to grapple with as they try to take on a role or enact a certain role like leadership. So, some questions that we haven't asked yet, but would be really great in terms of marrying that project and this project could be around, when do people feel like their leadership is most natural versus most challenged? And, if we think about where this happens, what is kind of the patterning of that? So what about you, Allie? Where do you think that your leadership seems most natural to you, or where do you feel like you're definitely not a leader?
Well, there's many places where I'm certainly not a leader, but I think what's interesting, I think, reflecting on the context in which leadership is done, I would say, so I went to business school in Canada in the late 90s, not that I'm dating myself, but I think then leadership, the context of leadership was kind of tied to this big office building. For me, it was like downtown Toronto, right? I wanted this big office building, wearing a power suit, a little briefcase, and it was still very male and very masculine and very hierarchically oriented, and that might have really influenced this whole, like, I need to get the role in order to be, in order to feel like a leader. There was a lot of discussion in our business school class about what roles we were going to get and who was going to what industry and what job and titles. But, I think if I look at how that has shifted so much over time, and if I look at the MBA classes and the executive classes that I teach now, it's a totally new reality of what leadership is and how leadership is defined. So I don't think anymore, if I were to ask in a class, what is the context of leadership? Where is leadership done now? People wouldn't most naturally, I don't think of an office building. Look at us now. Leadership's done from our bedrooms, sometimes from the hallway as our children are sleeping in their rooms, sometimes from a makeshift office. I've seen people doing leadership in closets now. So the context of leadership is changing, which enables a different type of leadership to emerge. Different leader behaviors, different people. It's kind of flattening the hierarchy. I'll see people take leadership roles online in some of my classes who would have never stood up and took leadership in a face-to-face program. So I'm quite excited about the shifting context and place leadership is being done, because it's just enabling new styles, new types, and new forms of leadership.
So I think what I hear you saying is that, perhaps our new virtual environment is making it easier for us to enact different frames, for us to think about our leadership as being more flexible and not place bound, right? But I think it would be really interesting to look at, the person who usually led through boardrooms and is now leading through their closet, and the ways in which their leadership might be enacted differently in those situations.
Absolutely. And that is, if anything good were to come out of COVID, it's been such a nightmare over the last year. It's this kind of new way of looking at work, looking at the world, and it is enabling different forms and styles of leadership and work that I think it has needed to happen. And so I'm quite excited about the possibilities that has enabled for work across the world. So, yeah. And I think that gives us, I think on that note, that kind of rounds out some of our past research, but also shaping what we're going to be looking at in the next year to come.
Right. We've been talking about the origins of our relationship and how it sets us up for the future.
Exactly, and how it's going to, set us into a pattern of what we're going to look at in the future. So I guess as a final question for everyone out there, it's to really think about that the stories that you tell yourself about your leadership and what it is and what it means, and if you can practice using different ones, and trying out new identities and trying on new styles of leadership, and also ways of seeing others as leadership, as leaders.
Wonderful. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today.
Thanks, Brianna. We'll talk to you soon.